Welcome to the Agile On The Mind podcast, where we discuss how to build intelligent teams inspired by agility and the world of cognitive science. If you're listening to this podcast, there's a good chance you'll enjoy the Agile On The Mind Substack. To receive a free weekly newsletter or podcast with explorations of agility and cognitive science, complete with tools, tips, and tricks, go to agileonthemind.substack.com and click subscribe. If you really want to support the work even more, you can upgrade to a paid membership. This week's Agile On The Mind podcast is featuring my close friend, Yon Borthwick. Yon is a team coach at the Boston Consulting Group. He's got a lot of experience working with individuals and teams in various coaching modalities that we hear about throughout the episode. And crucially to this, Yon is also an experienced Dungeons & Dragons player, and he's my personal dungeon master, not just for me, but Yon and I have played Dungeons & Dragons and other tabletop role-playing games for a few years now, and we'll hear more about that from Yon in the episode. That sounds like a good place to welcome Yon to the podcast.
Yeah. Hi, Daniel. Hi, everyone.
Hi,
listening.
Yon. Good to have you here. Yon, could you tell us a bit about how you got to do the kind of work that you do now?
Oh, yeah, sure. So I'll try and feel into doing that without just rolling off something. So what I am excited about in doing the work that I do is helping people live more empowered and fulfilled lives. Part of the purpose of why I'm about what I'm about, and I do that in many different ways. A big part of that is like connecting to themselves, building self-awareness, and then actioning that into the world. I've always been interested in that element. Growing up, did a lot of kind of youth leading summer camps, always with young people, did a degree in philosophy and English literature, which are both two different lenses on what is the human condition, right? What does it mean to live a good life? And after leaving university with that kind of degree, you can't get any job in that to do with your degree, at least. So I went into youth work and ended up working with older and older young people until I was managing a team of young people. And then I learned I could do this not with young people, I could actually do this in organizations. So I started working in L&D. And while I was doing that, I studied a degree in psychology because I wanted to go into organizational psychology. Psychology is fascinating as a topic and as a school of thought. However, for me, ended up being a lot of like statistics and maths and not really like with the people, which is the thing that I missed from like, you know, the L&D kind of part of me, or the working in development part of me. And I was managing a team of 8 people studying part-time. And then I did this 3-day course in integral development coaching, which is the main modality of coaching that I work. And I was like, oh, this is it. I don't want to be like making big kind of organization-wide interventions. I want to be working with people on the ground with their world and their lives and their mindset and their psychology. And coaching for me felt like a much more comfortable and empowering methodology than, for example, therapy, right? Which is super powerful, but a completely different methodology. So I quit my job after I graduated and started my own coaching business, and I ran my own coaching business for 4 and a bit years. And then I got headhunted by Boston Consulting Group, and they were like, hey, do you want to do some of this stuff in-house with our teams and our leaders on how to organize teams? And I was like, well, we had a little bit of a talking, because a lot of organizations, I think, don't really do team coaching in the best way, but Boston do it pretty well, and all the coaches I spoke to had the right kind of mindset when it came to this kind of work. And now I've been there for 2.5 years, helping people communicate better and be better as groups and better as individuals, basically. So yeah.
And one of the reasons that I was especially excited to have you on the Agile On The Mind is for the parallel story that was also, I know, going alongside that, which was your experience with games and tabletop role-playing games. And in particular, we started playing Dungeons & Dragons together during the pandemic, and that's been a really like beautiful and fruitful experience or set of experiences. So for those of my audience who aren't familiar with Dungeons & Dragons or with fantasy role-playing games, give a quick primer into what is this world? What's it about? What is it that appeals to you about it? And what is it that keeps you playing?
Yeah, great question. So, what is a role-playing game? We might think of when we were kids, right? At the very basis, role-playing is kind of playing imaginary games, right? That you might have done when you were a little kid running around the playground, like with swords on a base level. On another level, it's kind of communal storytelling together as a group. And on another level, it's a game, which is a game system. So fundamentally, I think it's about telling stories as a group. And as humans, we are people of stories. We live in our own story, our own narrative, but we also live in a culture which is surrounded by stories, whether it's folk tales or movies or books. And this is a way to kind of engage in an interactive storytelling. So part of me wants to be like, well, if somebody hasn't heard of that, what could that look like? And we might do like a minute or two example right here, right now. How does that feel?
Let's do a minute or two example right here, right now.
Okay. So Daniel, you're in a fantasy world and you are walking down a path. There are trees on your left and on your right. You've been tasked with like carrying a package down to the next village by your employer. You've got a bow on your back, you've got a sword in your arm, and you can see in the path ahead of you there is a tree blocking the path. What do you do?
I carefully look to see if there's any bandits behind the tree.
You're suspicious, so you look around. At this point, if we were playing the game, I'd ask you to like roll some dice, right? Because you're choosing to do an action. You don't know the kind of the outcome of the action. So you roll some dice depending on who you are. Let's say you roll really high, and what you notice is there is like a red cloak you can just see the edge of on the edge of the trees, and it feels to you like there might be some people waiting in ambush. What would you do?
I would call out to them and try and say, "Don't mess with me. I'm armed and I'm dangerous." I would try and threaten them. Yeah.
You're trying to threaten them. Right. So at that point, we might like start to get into a story of like me being the bandit, you threatening us. We might roll some more dice. And that's basically, for our listeners who maybe haven't played Dungeons and Dragons before or haven't seen any of the kind of massive online kind of podcasts and videos and YouTubes and all of this stuff that's out there. That's basically it, right? We're telling a story together with our imaginations.
So what's a dungeon master?
So in a game, you usually have players and a dungeon master. The dungeon master runs the world, and the players run their player characters, which is their characters. So like you were running yourself just in that example, and I was controlling the world. So the dungeon master sets the scene. They are part narrator, part curator, part storyteller, and every dungeon master is different in how they excel. There's lots of different roles, and I'm sure we'll get onto this later, but just as an agile coach might fulfill lots of different roles with a team, a dungeon master has to fulfill lots of different roles within a game.
Yeah, so there's something like the dungeon master's job is to like help everyone have a good time and tell a good story, whatever good story looks like, right? Like I've also dungeon mastered for our group as well, and it's such an interesting mindset to go into because you're trying to create a space where the team, the players can have a good time, tell a good story, where they're met with interesting challenges, but you don't want to like tell them what they're supposed to be doing. So you need to give them enough freedom that they can do something fun and feel unconstrained, but enough constraints that they're not just able to do anything. There are rules.
Yeah, and what I'm sure you felt this as well at points. There are points where I've DM'd where I've been like, oh no, I haven't given enough boundaries, right? To enable an effective story to come out, you need boundary. Otherwise, you just get like, well, I could do absolutely anything, right? Which is like very kind of paralyzing in a way, right? We want to feel like we have a motivation, a direction in our life, and doubly so in stories, right? And those boundaries, and there's a question of like, how much do you put the boundary? How much do you put things in front of the players to kind of drive them forwards versus how much do the players kind of, generate their own motivations to move forwards within the world of the story?
Yeah, and I sort of want to like complete the picture for people who are like, this is two different things that are interesting. I sort of want to like draw the connection that I see between the role that you play as a dungeon master holding space for a team and sort of enabling their creativity to get towards a shared goal, which is fun and an interesting story and a good way of spending their time. And the role that you play as a Scrum Master or a coach for a team, where you are holding space for a group of creative people to deliver value for the organization or to achieve some sort of goal. And what can we learn from one to the other? Most likely, what can we learn from being a Dungeon Master to being a Scrum Master? Because this is called Agile on the Mind. It's not called Dungeons and Dragons on the Mind. That's the sequel.
Although,
so I guess,
funnily enough, we have been bringing in some agile aspects into our game and into our personal game. Although maybe not everybody notices, but I notice sometimes, and you sometimes look at me across the table and you're like,
Yeah, it's when your character decided to pull out a team contract and start contracting with the team about what kind of bandits we wanted to be that I was like, someone's done their coaching course with them. Anyway, we can explore that fully, telling the audience about our fantasy world together in a different episode.
Sure.
What I'm interested in finding out is, what have you seen in your professional world working with teams that you think you can borrow from the Dungeon Mastery fantasy role-playing world? What are some of the things that have helped you in that way around?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think that there's a few different elements for me, right? In that, in the world of role-playing and of being a DM, there is like the interrelational piece, the storytelling piece, and there's also like the structure piece. So there's relationships, there's story, and there's structure, right? And the structure, role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons is just one of them, the most well-known one, but there's lots of different systems, right? So we can think of that as kind of like the rules of play, right? And actually putting in different rules of play enables a different story to be told, or different rules enable different things for better enable different things within the gaming group to be had, right? And that is interesting because a team might talk about their norms, but norms are so wildly different per team that you don't very much get like, okay, we're playing by this set of norms and then we're going to play by this set of norms, and like how those two, can we feel how those two are different next to each other? Whereas if you're playing, for instance, Dungeons and Dragons versus Vampire the Masquerade, or versus another one that we've played like Fate, right? The people listening don't need to know the difference, but for example, Fate, it has very, 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 very few rules, right? It's very narrative, right? Whereas Dungeons and Dragons has quite a lot of rules, and Vampire has these kind of like things that put pressure on people because there's a lack of resources, right? And bad things happen when the resources run out. And so those things influence the kind of story that can be told, and similarly, and you really feel it using different systems, and that even with the same group of people. Whereas it's very rare to see, in a team, be like, okay, we're going to completely change our norms and we're basically playing the same game but with a different set of norms, and what is that like? So I think that's like an interesting thing to think about, of like, what is the affordance of the rules? What does that create? So that's one. And I think there's also something about like, when you're playing, there is a sense of experimentation that is live, like of not seriousness, right? And of forgiveness. If things go wrong, you kind of like, yeah, okay, like we kind of turn left instead of right, and we can figure it out, and we can reconnect, and we can, and because the stakes can feel really big if you lose a character, right? But at the end of the day, you're all playing, even if you get into arguments or this, that, the other, whereas things can feel a lot heavier, right? The stakes feel more real, maybe, even if they're not necessarily any bigger in reality.
Do you mean in the workplace, the stakes can feel heavier?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So there's something to learn about, I think, about the nature of experimentation, of play, of taking things more lightly, right?
And going with them as well. Like I know that some of the most interesting and like fulfilling stories that we've told together in our group, and just as a note to the audience, like these stories can go on for years. Like the game that we played in the pandemic, we would get together for like 3 hours a week and tell the same stories. You pick up where you left off, you get to know your characters, you're invested in the story. We have like rich fantasy world that we share whenever we come together for this. And like Yon as Dungeon Master or me as Dungeon Master, you have like a big story that you want to tell maybe, or some sort of idea. But the most fun bits are when it goes wrong and someone does something really stupid, or someone does some random act of violence that makes sense for their character but makes the group go like, what are you doing? But we're in this together and we have to solve it. And that creates the most fun, the most memorable moments. And I think about like the teams that I'm in where you want everything to kind of go to plan, right? And to get the big software release or to finish the project. But some of the things that bond us the most and that give us our best personal development or our most memorable stories at work are things that have gone wrong or didn't go to plan, or when someone did something that felt sensible but actually was ridiculous that we didn't realize, and we had to adapt to that. And in Dungeons and Dragons, it's obviously fun because the whole thing is there to be fun, and like it comes with that lens. Whereas when it happens at work, it can feel much more threatening or much more serious or much more something like that. Maybe that is more threatening, right? Like if I lose at Dungeons and Dragons, I'm not gonna like run out of money and like have my house repossessed. Whereas if I like get fired from my job, maybe. Right. But maybe the question for us as coaches is like, how can we create more of that atmosphere of safety, so that it can be just as effective and also like fun and exploratory and supportive and something like that.
So a great thing that one of the many kind of like wisdoms that is out there around DMing is, it's interesting you said lose Dungeons and Dragons. You can't lose, right? Is that failure is part of the story. Actually, to have nobody's life is all highs, right? And especially in our society when we're surrounded by social media and, you know, all of these things that are like, look at all the good things that are happening. You're only allowed to share the good. Only share the good. And we as team coaches and Scrum Masters and Agilists, we're aware that like actually to create a place where there is psychological safety, we have to share the failure. We have to, you know, say, what is an intelligent failure? What do we learn? How can we grow? And actually taking that, accepting it as part of the narrative and part of the story, and celebrating it, and not just as what we learn, but like, wow, do you remember that thing? That was really full on. And wasn't it amazing that we got through it and we did X, Y, Z? And celebrating that is really good, right? But it can be challenging, right? Yeah, interesting. I'm now wondering, what is it when somebody's character does something absolutely terrible? Why is that more memorable and more easy to laugh about? I guess because there's fear of judgment, right? If I do something that is an error or a mistake. But if I feel really psychologically safe with people, I probably can laugh about it with them.
I think I'm thinking of one of our friends, Zach, whose character, he always seems to bring up characters who like do the socially unacceptable thing that ends up getting like ineptly and getting us in trouble. And like, this is not what my friend is like at all. So I always find it kind of jarring. You're like, why? That's not what but then I remember, well, that's not what you're like in the real world. But like in this game, my job is to like, well, play my own character, but also to like be in team with this person. And it's like the thing that makes it like both jarring and fun is, I don't know, the unexpectedness of it, or the safety, or the feeling that like, right, we're going to have to go with this sort of plan. I don't know. Is that your experience of it? Because we play differently, you know, we operate different characters.
We do operate different characters, and also have operated different characters at different times, right? And there's like a few different things that goes on for me. It's like, one, it is a mental exercise, and there's some like theories around how D&D or role-playing games in general can be used as almost like a form of like building empathy. It is a mental exercise to step into shoes of somebody else for 2 or 3 hours, right? To inhabit a different mindset. And also it's almost an exercise in empathy to have to work as part of a team with somebody who maybe you're like, why are you doing this? Right? Or what are you like? And it makes me think about what are the characters that we might put on when we go to work, and if we're able to flex or change our own shape of who we are, both in our habits and how we interact with people, but also as like part of our brand, right, within, you know, in the working world. And how maybe if we were a little bit more practiced at you know, showing people empathy and trying out different things ourselves, there might be a little bit more flexibility in how we can all turn up with the team. Because there's an idea in ORSC, which is organizational relationship systems coaching, which talks about roles within a team and how you can get role fatigue if you are stuck within, like, if you're the person who is always challenging, or you're the person who's always, pushing people along, motivating people, we get kind of tired and then get burnt out. But if you have more flexibility in your role and there's more motility across the system, I'm not sure if I used motility right there, but it feels right.
Oh, good.
Yeah, then it means that people are able to try on different hats, and therefore you have a more sustainable kind of team or system of people, which is interesting.
Yeah, I like that. I think the thing that made me think about what I enjoy at those moments where like my close friend does something that I find like super jarring in the game is that like I know that it's like not personal. I know it's not about me, and I know that my role there is to like still tell this story and like sort of problem solve in that narrative world. Whereas at work, when I find I'm working with someone difficult, or that I find difficult, let's say, it feels like it's more about me. Like this person is getting in the way of me and my important work and me and my thing. Whereas I don't employ that same flexibility that you described, that same motility at like, how can I experience someone at work and we have a difficult interaction. It's like, okay, if I was in Dungeons and Dragons, what would I do? Okay, maybe I'll whip out a sword and take off their head, but that's probably not available to me in this context. What else might I do? Well, I might try and like work out how can I support them, or how can I work out what their character goals are, or what am I missing that it made sense for them to play the way that they're playing. And if I look at my colleagues around me as if they're all like Dungeons and Dragons characters playing a role at work, what does that open up in terms of how I can show up whilst still like, doing that in ways that serve us and, responsibly and professionally and blah, 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 blah. I don't need to make the clarifications about responsibly and professionally. I think we get enough. You should be responsible and professional at work. I think I want to lean more into we should be silly and imagine that everyone is like pretending to be a wizard at work, pretending to be a software developer today.
What comes up for me then is like, in the role of Dungeon Master, I'm really aware that everybody is pretending and being silly, which means that things are gonna go completely off the rails, right? Off the rails being like, I might have an idea of the story that I want to tell, right? But because I am with a bunch of complex people who have their own ideas of how to do things and what is fun, that it is going to go left as soon as we leave the archetypal tavern. I'll be like, okay, guys, here's some people that you should definitely follow. And everybody will be like, no, we're going to go to the cave where that old witch is. I'm like, I mentioned her like 3 weeks ago. I haven't planned anything for that. Oh my God. No, please. I might keep on putting the things in front of people. But when people are motivated and when you're faced with like complex humans, they're going to do what they're going to do, right? And so that kind of role, when I think about that as the role of the coach or of a leader, right, is like, do you go along with the motivation of the group, of the system, in whatever way they want to go? Or do you put things in front of them to try and encourage them to go a certain way? And where is that, like, balance? Because in a team, I could just be like, no, guys, I think this is really the priority, here, for instance, if I'm a leader. As a coach, that's not really my role, right? I'm more like, well, cool, you guys want to go to the witch cave? Makes sense.
Which is like, and that's part of the tension that we sort of have to resolve. In that, like the game is in a way it's non-directional. Like as long as everyone's having a good time and wants to show up next week, the game has been a success. Whereas if my product team wants to like go off and like invest in some interest that has got nothing to do with like the business goals that they've been employed for, then that's a problem. However, it's not a binary decision, right? Like the thing about the Witch's Cavern is like, even if your product manager or your manager or whoever says to this team, right, you need to go to this place, this is what's important, the team will still go to their own like version of the Witch's Cavern in that story. Like, they'll go to where they think they're supposed to be going, or they'll do what they think they're supposed to be doing. And if the fantasy world isn't set up in a way where the fun story makes sense, they won't go that way. And if the business world, the business context is set up in such a way where like the outcomes that we're looking for make the same kind of sense, then the team will go slightly differently, and you won't find out until much later. What Agile does well, right, is it says, well, let's finish stuff, let's deliver value, and then we can like check that the value we're delivering is the thing that we want and inspect and adapt along the way. I guess I'm interested in the ways in which this is emergent. Like human behavior in teams emerges within certain constraints, to use complexity and Dave Snowden-y language. The team's behaviors, the team's patterns, this stuff emerges from all the different features of the landscape. And so too, that happens with your Dungeons and Dragons team. So yeah, riff on that. How does emergence play into how you act as a dungeon master? Or if there's a better question that you want me to have asked, feel free to answer that.
The way I think about it as a dungeon master, and you've experienced this in DMing yourself, is like, I come with enough of the world prepared that it is flexible and fun and feels robust for the team, for the players, right? In that when I'm playing a game, I want to feel like the world is real, right? That I can go over there and open that door and there'll be something there for me, something interesting to be in. And that there's enough going on in the world that like interests me. So it's not just like a blank slate, right? I don't want to be in a world which is like, and there's just around every corner, it's just the same cookie cutter goblins that have been copied and pasted everywhere, right? So there needs to be like variety, depth, robustness. But behind that, if I try and create that if I try and make it really robust in my head, one, I'm going to spend ages doing it. Two, the complexity and the emergence of the team is going to meet where I want to go. And there's this concept in D&D which we call railroading, right? Which we don't want to be put, as players, we don't want to be put on a railroad that is a traditional story, right? Traditional story, book, film, anything like that doesn't have that possibility for emergence. You're going on a journey on a train. And that is necessarily not what D&D or role-playing is about. In my opinion, some Dungeons & Dragons players might disagree, but you don't want to funnel people down that way. And so if you look behind the curtain of this robust facade, it's all kind of tape and PVA glue, right? It's actually flexible enough that if you go left, I can change the scenery around and move and interact with the emergence of the team. And there's enough things in my arsenal to be like, okay, we're going to put something there, we're going to put something there, we're going to throw something there. And I think a lot of the things that we see when we look at media, like podcasts, like Critical Role or Dimension 20, or these big like podcasts or YouTube or Twitch channels, which are professionals playing this, right?
So these are like professional Dungeons and Dragons players making a podcast.
Yeah, exactly. They're usually like voice actors. One, they are doing it for an audience. Two, they're professionals. Three, they have so much money to create have loads of tools available and spend the time doing it. But when it's me and you, Daniel, I don't have like all of 3 days to prepare for our game, right? Nor would I, because if I did, invariably you're going to spend the whole 3 hours having brunch and not going anywhere. So it would be a waste of time. But a specific example.
That's a really pointed attack there. Wow. It's just like Yon, you create worlds in which it's just really fun to pretend to have brunch with your friends once a week. And if that means we don't get to go on your exciting fantasy adventures, that's our decision.
That's it. And that's fine, right? And I think a lot of the time, definitely when I was first DMing, I was like, come on, we're going this way. And when you're first playing, you kind of need that. You need to be like, what? Yeah, there is a monster, there is a dragon, there is a thing. But as you mature as a player and as a DM, the more interesting stuff is the emergent stuff. Like what happens when my character, I don't know, parents got slaughtered by werewolves, meets another character who's half werewolf. Like what is that like, right? What is that interaction? And what happens when we like go to a temple? Like, am I interested in the god? Am I not interested in the god? Am I against all gods? Like what, that continuous question of like, how am I interacting with the world and how the world develops around me and how the story actually starts to develop around the players, right? So for instance, if a player says to me, you know, okay, I grew up, my dad was an elf and my mum was a dwarf, right? That suddenly says to me as a DM, how did those two meet? And why is that not a usual pairing? If it's not a usual pairing, right? Which then like asks the question of like, well, what is Dwarven society like? And what is Elven society like? Do they have touch points? And when in the story are we going to interact between those touch points? It leaves an option for saying, well, maybe they do hang out a lot. Maybe they don't, right? And so you're you're continuously kind of in concert or in play together.
And there's also something about like if I want my players to go a certain way, I can make them, right? Like I did that a little bit in the last campaign where I was Dungeon Master, where I was like, I want you to go back in time. So I essentially like made a world where it was really hard for you to not do the thing I wanted. It was like a room appears in front of you and everything else is daggers. Like, do you want to go in? Like, yeah, sure. So I can make that happen, but it's not much fun, and it doesn't feel like you had any agency there. And like you will do my story, but it won't be very good. And that reminds me of the kinds of management or the kinds of like team plannings where like it's very clear where we're going to go. It's not the team don't have any agency in deciding that, and they build or they do the thing that the organization wants them to do, but they hate it in the process. And if I like a really skilled dungeon master, and this is maybe my next question, like a really skilled dungeon master can set up the conditions where the cool stories or the cool conflicts will emerge, and you know that the story will go in a good direction, and will be fun and will probably be something like what you wanted it to, because you've set the conditions in such a way that makes it inevitable. And then I don't have to worry about like railroading the characters down that way, because there are fundamental forces set up in this world that mean that the good story will emerge. And it's similar with a product team where you're saying, if you set up the problem and you have a team that care about this problem and they have the skills to solve the problem and they have license to, and they have the space to explore, they will get to a good answer. And then leadership's responsibility there is to help make sure that the constraints are in place, that the team can experiment and have agency and find good solutions without having to be forced down a particular angle and still achieving the outcome.
Yeah.
So I guess so think with that in mind, with that exploration, to put it politely or to put it generously to myself in mind, what are some of the ways that a dungeon master can set up a team in the game that enables a good, coherent story to emerge, but doesn't railroad them?
Yeah, it's a good question. The first thing that comes up for me as you're speaking is there's something about internal motivation, right? There's like a feeling of autonomy, of competence. And there's a third one, which I can't remember, that Dan Pink talks about in his thing, autonomy, mastery, and something else.
Purpose?
Purpose? Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Let's go with that. So there's something about understanding what people's skills are, clarifying with them, that they are free to do what they want to do, and clarifying the rules in which we're going to play. What is the purpose? And in D&D, we have a session 0 usually before starting a game, when we say we do kind of, a team alliance, if you will. What do people want to get out of the story? What kind of story do they want to play? And that sets up the kind of foundations for what people want and also what people don't want, right? Which is kind of similar to a norms discussion that you might have with a team of what is the in and out behavior, what are we okay with, what are we not okay with. So there is that level. There's also the question of like, what do the players want, but also what does the dungeon master, what is the story the dungeon master wants to tell or build, etc. And recently, one of the things that I asked we're just starting a new game, and I asked Daniel and the rest of our players to do is think, what is the motivation of your character, right? What drives you forward? What is your purpose? And because that creates more of those emergent stories, right? We go into a town and it's not just like, okay, do whatever. You're pulled into a certain direction because of your motivation. And for a dungeon master, I think that is like, you're setting up the container, you're setting up the rules, you're setting up the prompts to get people thinking, what do you need to make this meaningful, useful, interesting for you as a player? And then how do those things interact, right? Like, how do your characters interact with the world? Which means understanding your players and giving them enough prompts and structures that you're kind of like creating that foundation. So I think that kind of session 0 is really useful, but also probably, checking in with what they enjoy, right? Like if you do a dungeon, there's loads of puzzles. We found out that one of our players just loves puzzles, right? And now he's like, can I make the puzzles? Right? And I'm like, yes, please. I don't want to make any puzzles. It'll take me hours. I'll have to research Reddit. And I'm very happy to give up the puzzle making piece of the story to people. And also some of the storytelling to be like, I don't have to describe every town we go into. If we go into a town and it's Daniel's character's hometown, I could be like, well, why don't you describe it and choose what's in it, right? Apart from maybe like a couple of the key players.
And I think that's Yeah, that's a really nice illustration of the ways in which, as Scrum Masters or as team managers, sometimes the best thing we can do is like step back and focus on like the highest level, most I don't know what the word is, the most like binding constraints, but then the other bits, like let the players, let the team work that out. So you know, the team arrives in a village and you say, what do you want to do? And like your your product team encounters a problem and you say, right, what do you want to do? And our job as Scrum Master and our job as Dungeon Master is to make sure that enough of the world makes sense that like we'll get to where we want to go around that, so that I can step back, not worry about describing every tavern, every interaction, every like chink of armor on the that the players are carrying around. And then it's a much more like collaborative, interesting, engaging, and like better story, because then you get all of their madness as well as just my own. And it's a lot more fun to Dungeon Master in that kind of situation as well.
Yeah, and then you're leaning into people's skills and passions as well, right? Because you get to have way better puzzles because the puzzle guy is making the puzzles. Or you recognize that actually nobody in the team wants to do this kind of work. Okay, well, if you need to do that kind of work, how are you going to get there? And what is the least effort that you could do to achieve the results that you need? And there's also the question of, do we really need to, right? Like, do we need to have the description from the tavern up until the palace? Or can we just cut off and be like, okay, now you're in the palace talking to the king, right? Like, we don't need to have all of that extra fluff necessarily if people aren't into it. And then there's the thing of like, but maybe you're into it. And that's also okay, right? It's okay to do some things just because you find them useful, right? Or interesting.
Because ultimately, like, when you're a Dungeon Master, or question is like, what kind of story do we want to be telling here? And you're very unconstrained there, because you can choose to say, right, like 5 years later and you're still ploughing this field, and that's fine because you can play with time like that. Like as Scrum Master, sometimes you want to be able to be like, yeah, we fast forward and the migration is done, Jesus, but you don't get that option. But you do get to ask your team, like, what kind of story do we want to look back and tell? That's a nice question. I think I might want to like play with that. You say, look, we're going to do some work together. We're going to embark on an adventure, a mission, a project. What do we want to be telling about this story? How do we want to be regaling each other in the future in our own local tavern about like what happened during this project and how it felt and how it was to be together? And then you can aim and construct a world around that whilst still getting the work done, but you can do it in a way that respects the storyness of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I quite like that in a way. You know, it reminds me almost of a pre-mortem, right? But a pre-mortem assumes that there's failure, right? What's like a positive kind of like backstory telling that you could do that's interesting. And what comes up for me is like during that story, if you're writing that out, it's worthwhile figuring out what the villains are, right? And like the villains of your story or the challenges or hurdles that you achieve, not just being like, oh, there's a villain, he's a bad guy because he's bad, right? Like villains need motivation, they need purpose. And villain is a strong word. We might not want to be like, well, this thing is a villain or this person in the organization is a villain. That might not be helpful. But using the language of like challenge, what is the challenges that we overcome? Why were they challenging? And what were the things that made them active in the world? Because when we're writing a story or writing a villain, being like, well, this person is a monster, that's a very boring story, right? But fleshing out and being like, well, why is that villain a villain? Well, if we look at Batman's villains, Mr. Freeze wants to save his wife who has a terminal condition, right? Or we look at the Joker, and the Joker thinks that the whole system is a joke, is broken, right? And so those are more interesting villains. And what would be the interesting challenges that you could write in that story of like, where do we want to be? What are the challenges that we faced? And what is the real purpose behind those challenges and why they arose? Could be cool.
Which then allows you, like, as a team trying to do something when you're encountering a problem, to be like, right, in the story that we're going to tell in the pub, this is going to be like one of the challenges we overcame. Yeah, if we personify it into a villain called whatever, the update, the unexpected software change or whatever. We need to workshop that.
I don't know, the USC.
Oh no, unexpected software update is back again, and this time he's got like fire breath and a big sword. Yeah, maybe we get to personify it a bit, and we get to realize that what we're doing, even if it doesn't feel like it, is a kind of play.
what comes up for me is if you have a continuous challenge, let's say you're in a system where unexpected software changes come up, you might even get like a plushy toy that is a monster and like bring it out when you have an unexpected software change and be like, oh no, okay, well what are the tactics we used to defeat this last time, right? Okay, right, which creates like a little bit of silliness, but also maybe makes it more lighthearted. Right.
Yeah, you play your baddie music, and everyone's like, "Oh, it's going to be a bad day because you're playing the eerie dungeon music." No.
Or you put on the combat music, and people get pumped, and they're like, "Okay, this is a challenge. We're on our feet, right?" And that's something that I think is really interesting. That like stress responses in the body can feel like positive challenge, or can feel really overwhelming. And telling a story and framing it as being like, this is combat. What does combat mean? Combat means we're on our feet, we're fighting fires, we're moving, we're thinking very actively, very quickly. And at the end, we get to have like a loot or a celebration, right? We get to get some sort of, success out of it. And that might enable you to feel that kind of stress maybe as excitement in a way, right? But because we know from playing Dungeons and Dragons, combat against a villain can be really nerve-wracking, right? But at the end, you're like, yeah, we did it, right? Which can also be the case when you get through something. But how do you have that peak is because you think of it as a challenge to overcome rather than like, oh my God, this is happening to me. Which is often something like the frame for a lot of people and a lot of teams in the workplace. Right? It's heavy rather than like something to step out over.
So it makes me think the idea of like the loot or the payoff or the level up, right? So in Dungeons and Dragons, if your players like achieve a really significant goal, they kill the dragon or they rescue the princess or whatever, they might level up. Right, and they'll gain new skills or new perspectives, or they'll gain new powers, or they'll get better at something. It's maybe a good question at the end on like a retrospective on a week where we've had like a really difficult sprint. Is you ask, like, right, in what ways did you level up from this? What was the loot? What was the conquest? Like, what did you find? The unexpected gem in this dungeon.
That also invites a growth mindset mentality, right? Because you're literally asking, where did we grow, right? Where did you grow as an individual in overcoming this?
We're starting to play a more realistic version of D&D, right? Where we say like, look, if your character like loses their hand, they have to like play without a hand, and they like can't carry as big stuff as easily and stuff like that. So maybe that's like that maps as well. It's like, right, in which ways did we like find loot? In which ways did we like sustain injury? And like now we'll find some stuff harder. I'm joking about it. Actually, it's not a terrible question to ask. Like, what were some of the like at the end of this sprint? In what ways are we wounded and we need to rest? That could also be a really reasonable question that has like sensible answers as well.
That's an interesting one because rest is factored into the structure of these games often, right? Like you have a limited amount of resources, you need to rest before you face other challenges. And that is not often necessarily a conversation that a team has, right? It's like one sprint and then another sprint and then another sprint. And like that question of like, well, what do we need to actually recover, because we don't have an infinite number of resources. That's just not humanly possible. That's a good question.
Yeah, the D&D mechanic is quite good for it because there are certain magic users in the in the game who have spell slots, and like after they've gone to sleep for the night, they like regain all their spell slots or something like that. If they rest for an hour, they get another spell back, and then they are like more well equipped. So you can send that character out when they haven't got any spells left. They'll just be useless, or they'll be more useless. And maybe that's the right thing to do because like that's part of the story. It's like, oh shit, we've like arrived at the dungeon and like our wizard has only got one spell left. Like, what are they going to do? That is kind of, there are team scenarios like that where you go like, yeah, this person's exhausted, and maybe they can do like the admin type, low level brain stuff, but like really they're not going to be the one that you want to send into the stressful meeting because that would like tip them over the edge, like with no blame on that person, just like they've just come off this really intense stressful project and like now's not the time to put them on another one. Yeah, and we don't really have like a language for that in the worlds of work that I'm used to. We talk about sustainable pace in Agile, but we don't talk about like what happens when you have had a peak and now you need to have a trough.
Yeah, and also within the way a D&D party is structured, not always, but usually you will have sets of different people with different skill sets, right? Different character classes, they're called. So you might have the wizard, the fighter, the thief, the priest. And when you have one of those people who are knocked out or, who's run out of resources, it doesn't just influence that person and how they play, but it also influences their entire party, right? You don't have your wizard okay, you can't cast any big spells. Probably you don't want to get into any massive battles, right? You don't have your priest. Suddenly you're going to have to be really careful because you don't have any healing capacity. That's not always the case, but that's similar in like teams, right? You have people with different specialities, etc. And when somebody is resting, whether that's like, okay, they just need to be on less mental task or whatever, or whether that's literally taking holiday, you need to, factor that in. So I wonder if there's something where you might map out and talk about, well, what are the long rests and short rests? What do people need to do to resource themselves? And what does that look like? And how flexible can your team be at different points about that, right?
And also, it brings up the sort of multidisciplinary team element of a D&D campaign. Like, it's not as much fun when you have like 5 big burly fighters that hit things with sticks. Like, it's fun when you have like the nerdy wizard playing off against like the religious fundamentalist cleric who's talking to the sort of rogue, ranger character that's like a loner who wants to be in the forest, and like the emergent things that happen between them. And then the cleric like heals the fighter that they've been having a bit of a conflict with. And there's something really lovely about that. And you say, look, we don't all need to be good at the same things. We just need to be a party together. They call it that. Like, that's the D&D language for this group, like the party. And it makes me think, when we hire people for roles, we tend to hire like a role profile that is generic, right? I need 6 of these shaped people with these skills, but we don't think about like who's going to be the sort of the peacemaker, or who's going to be the person who you want to send out to attack senior stakeholders and, to go out for war, or who's the person that's going to be like the planner. And actually, like, a coherent party is made up of these different proclivities, and a good balance is what you need. And that's true in our team settings as well. But we like the thing the thing I experience when I think about like talking about that at work is like, well, that could be seen as unprofessional or overly personal, or like people could bring in their baggage or their trauma around their own personality, proclivities and preferences or whatever in a way that might be difficult. Which, I don't know, maybe there's something about the roles idea in ORSC that could be interesting there. Like you mentioned, different teams have different roles.
Yeah, I think like the thing in ORSC is there are different roles that every team needs that are fulfilled, which you might be leaning more towards. But the thing that comes up for me when you're talking about that is like, if we think about emergence and complexity, our human side of it, our values, our personality, our proclivities, how we act, the kind of person that we are, not just our skills, factor into that emergence, right? That's a huge part of it. And if we don't think about that at all, you're missing a huge amount of the picture. And you might get lots of people with different skills, but are all the same type of role, right? So if you have a bunch of people who are very comfortable putting their head down and just getting on with it and don't really want to make connections with people, you might have very different skill sets, but then you don't have them really gaining the benefit of maybe looking out for each other and like peacemaking and those softer skills. And that's going to lead to a whole bunch of other challenges down the line. So you want to keep, or you'll end up with someone having to be a peacekeeper who's not very skilled at it. And then they will have to grow and learn and develop, and you will have to support them to do that. Right. And I've definitely had to do that within teams, is like, okay, well, nobody here is very good at communication. Let's start right at the basics, right, and build up from there. But you could shortcut that by having people who are able to do that within their kind of skill set.
And there's 2 different directions there. Like, one is you have certain people that are good at certain things. So I remember a few years ago, I was working in a team where like someone was seen as quite like combative, and that caused conflict within the team. And I was like, no, you want this person to be combative because it makes them really good at like going and talking to stakeholders and going and like unblocking problems and getting the team what they need. We need to find a way that combativeness doesn't like lead to disharmony and frustration and conflict within the team, but like don't throw the baby out with the bathwater there. Like, we just need to make these things work in harmony. So there's an element of like, just like your D&D team needs the like nerdy wizard to go and study all the books and find out the answer to the puzzle, that might also cause conflicts in other times where the team needs to be like running quickly and the wizard's like, no, I'm going to go and fetch all the books. So it's like, no, the person who stayed behind to look at the library and didn't help you in that battle is the person that helped you, is using that same quality when they helped you solve the last mission. But the alternative is also true, which is like, I remember in our campaign during the pandemic, I played this nerdy wizard who ended up getting in an arm wrestling match with some local yokel at a pub. And we ended up doing like a contested strength competition where basically we rolled dice, and like I was really disadvantaged there. I think I had like minus strength points. And in the end, like through just complete luck, my character, Auroron, of blessed memory, because he died, Auroran like won the arm wrestle competition, and everyone was like, "Yeah!" And it was this like big burly local person in our fantasy world was like, "Yeah, nice one, nerd," and gave him a good punch on the shoulder. So, in the absence of someone for whom the thing you need is a strength, that also gives someone an opportunity to step up into a role they wouldn't normally play, and maybe like that can work as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. It's like those memorable pieces are unexpected and they're growth, right? I'm sure we've all been in points in our work where we've been doing something that we didn't expect to, and then we turn around and we're like, oh, I can't believe I did that. Yeah, that's growth, that's development. Character development, if you will.
We are starting to come to the end of our allocated time. Is there anything that has come up that you hadn't had a chance to bring in or talk about, or a question that you want us to look at before we wrap up?
Yeah, good question. One of the things that happens in Dungeons and Dragons when you have a group of people come together is there is a sense of we're in this together. We're telling a shared story. We want to be here. We're telling it together. Different people have different ways of doing it, but we are fundamentally pulling in the same direction. And even that creates sometimes challenges, even when a character doesn't really fit in, right? We've had before characters that they're like, okay, well, everybody kind of doesn't like you. We have to kind of like stick together. How do we make sure that that makes sense, makes coherent sense? Whereas like in organizations and teams, that question of like, are we in it together? I think there's something there of creating that feeling, right? You talked about creating the container that enables the team to pull in the right direction or in a good direction, have a good story. And I think fundamentally there is that the sense of we're in this together and we're pulling in the same direction is so important. And that's something that you already have by getting together as a group for D&D because it's fun, right? And so the question for me is like, where can we bring or ensure that is always within place? Because like we're in this together just because we get paid doesn't lead to the best story in Dungeons and Dragons or in the world of teams, right? In organizations, not particularly interesting. So there needs to be something else around like the motivation and the identity of those groups, right? That is beyond that, I think. And I'm going to get curious about that.
Maybe that's something we can chat about and have you back to talk about this kind of stuff again, because this has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's been good.
Yon Borthwick, thank you for coming on Agile on the Mind.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for having me. And thanks everyone for listening to us talk about this. Great fun.
Thank you for listening to Agile on the Mind with me, Daniel Susser, and our guest, Yon Borthwick. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support this work, please subscribe to Agile on the Mind on your podcast player or directly on the Agile on the Mind Substack. That's agileonthemind.substack.com. If you want to really, really support this work, you can upgrade to a paid subscription on Substack, which really helps me continue these explorations of team intelligence, bringing together the worlds of cognitive science and agility. We'll see you next time.